King of an African-American holiday. This year, our third year of celebrating Kwanzaa, we've once again added what I'd say is an innovation component to the event by introducing the title and the theme, Kwanzaa Intellectuals, who our speaker series. And so this year we have bestowed the title on this evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Gerald Horne. In his book, Maize defines Kwanzaa as follows. I think favorably he says, a hodgepodge of indigenous African practices placed inside a Black American ritual framework. He also argues that Kwanzaa has become the Black Power movement's most enduring cultural legacy through its efforts to remind the Black community of its African roots. In our first Kwanzaa intellectual keynote lecturer, let me try to tie together why we have endowed Dr. Gerald Horne with this illustrious title. The basic facts you know because they're on your flyer. Dr. Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne is also an author, a teacher scholar, a historian, a lawyer, an activist, and a public intellectual. But what distinguishes Horne's academic profile from others, nonetheless, is the range, the depth, and distinction of his scholarship. He has written over 30 scholarly books whose topics critically interrogate, navigate, and excavate the contours of an array of themes that encapsulate the subject of his keynote lecture today, entitled The World and African Americans in Black Liberation and Internationalism. Horne has been described by his peers honorifically as a revisionist historian who impresses on the need to think about revitalizing the radical tradition through the means of revisioning and rewriting our history and our past. In Horne's latest book, perhaps his 31st or 32nd, I think, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans and the British Empire Fight the US Before Emancipation, revisionism, as defined by Horne when he asserts that every generation has to rewrite history, constitutes the main methodology. Horne himself is quoted to have said, "At one time, there was a prevalent Moonlight and Magnolias version of slavery and Reconstruction that fundamentally portrayed happy Negroes during the slave era." Continues Horne, this began to change, however, in the 1930s with the publication of Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, and changed decisively with the publication of Eric Foner's Reconstruction. Dr. T.P. Wilkinson has also written a review of Horne's latest book, Negro Comrades, for the Black Agenda Report, that is recently hot off the press. And that underscores what I think is the distinctiveness of Horne's work. He writes, by illuminating the shadowy US War of 1812 against Great Britain, not only in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, but in the struggle against chattel slavery, in which the Haitian Revolution was a critical part, Horne continues in the style of C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins, by recovering the voices of Africans throughout the British Empire, the Caribbean, and the USA. Horne makes also deep imprints on our Black Studies discipline. In addition to his current distinguished Joint Chair position in History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, Horne has held chairmanships of the University of California, Santa Barbara's AAAS department, as well as the Department of African American and African Studies at the University of North Carolina. Horne's Black Studies scholarship is uniquely diasporic, as it straddles every corner of the Black world where he unearths our voices, our agencies, our stories, and documents our contributions to key events in world history. Among these numerous communities and networks of Black communities worldwide, just some of Horne's works include Negro Comrades, which I've talked about, where we've already seen how he straddled US Blacks and Haitian revolutionary struggles. He's got Red Seas, which is a story of radical Black sailors in the US and Jamaica. He's got Race War, White Supremacy and African Americans in Japan. The End of Empires, African Americans and India. The Deepest South, the United States and Brazil. Black and Brown, African Americans and Mexico. Mau Mau in Harlem, US and Black liberation in Kenya. From the Barrel of the Gun, US and Black liberation in Zimbabwe. And I think his forthcoming book, he tells me 2013-14, is about Black liberation and slavery in Cuba. So just a few more things I'd like to share about our Kwanzaa intellectual before I invite him up to deliver what is obviously a much awaited lecture. We wouldn't honor Dr. Horne with this prestigious title if, in addition to his prestigious body of scholarship, he didn't embody what Mays has also called Kwanzaa's Black Power legacy of social transformation and community engagement. Horne is a renowned media commentator. You should check him out. Democracy Now!, Russia Today, and public intellectual of important public policy issues. Horne's activist and research records and documents are archived at the Schomburg Museum in Harlem, New York City, as well right here as part of MSU's African Activist Archive Project, digital collection, with the help of Chris Root, the project manager of this project. We have found 4 entries of Horne's Africa activism, Coalition to Support the Liberation of Southern Africa in New York City in 1980, Capital District Coalition Against Apartheid and Racism, Albany, New York, January 1986, Ad Hoc Committee to Oppose Apartheid in U.S. Tennis, Albany, New York, 1987, and Divest New York, End All Ties with Apartheid South Africa between the 1970s and 80s, we're not sure when it was dated. The topic that Horne will broach for us today, this evening, will equally help us to reflect on our Kwanzaa theme. Horne will speak on Du Bois, a pioneer of African American cultural nationalism and one of the founders, one of the many founders, but an important one, of Pan-Africanism, but also on Du Bois's wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, or as Horne refers to him in the title of his book on her, Race Woman, and on Paul Robeson, a singer and actor, as well as an avid civil rights era political activist. So with that, MSU campus community and Greater Lansing, I invite you to please join me in a warm welcome of Dr. Gerald.
I love my speech right here. Let me see.
Oh, did I take it? I'm so sorry.
See, I was going to maintain this illusion that I would just come up and then speak without any notes. Just blew me away with that one. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank Professor Adozie and her hardworking team for arranging my visit. I appreciate it. And in a sense, in her introduction, she preempted my first point, but I'll mention it anyway, which is that one of the many reasons why it's good to be here at MSU is because for the last few years, at this time of year, in December, I picked up my pen and written a check made out to MSU. And the most recent one was just mailed on Friday and may already have been cashed. And why am I sending money to East Lansing? Well, the check is designated for the account of the African Activist Archive Project at MSU, which collects and digitizes documents and artifacts with a particular emphasis on the movement in the United States that was in solidarity with the liberation movements of Southern Africa, particularly South Africa. And I hope and trust that the students here will find the time to either peruse this wonderful archive or even utilize its resources for class papers, MA theses, doctoral dissertations, and the like, for it is a local jewel renowned across this small planet. I should add quickly that my donation to this archive is not wholly altruistic, as you might have gathered by now. For in this magnificent archive, one can also find documentation of my own political activism. In the 1970s and the 1980s, when I was residing in New York and intermittently heading the National Conference of Black Lawyers and matriculating at Columbia University, where I received my doctorate in history, and most importantly, deeply involved in the movement and solidarity for Southern African liberation and activity, which I'm prouder than anything I've done in my brief life. An activity that took me to Namibia, Southwest Africa, as a journalist in 1989 to report on the decolonization process that led to independence in 1990, and to Zimbabwe in 1995, where I worked on a book published in 2001 on the U.S. role in seeking to thwart the independence of this nation. I should add, all the while in New York, like many others, fortunately, I was organizing protest demonstrations at the Apartheid Council in Manhattan and organizing fundraising concerts for the liberation movements featuring artists like Hugh Masekela, and solidarity conferences in local churches and the like. And this was not altruistic either. For as a historian, I had long come to realize that the fate of Africans in North America was tied to the fate of Africans laboring under the yoke of colonialism on the continent itself. It's not accidental that Jim Crow began to crumble in this country in the 1960s, just as African nations were surging to independence, for as these nations attained independence, they were well placed to pressure the United States about our suffering, whereas as we attained rights on this side of the Atlantic, we were well placed to pressure the United States to change its pro-colonialism policies in Africa itself. Because conservatism has been so deeply ingrained in this nation, we of African descent in North America have had to rely upon our friends in the international community more than most in order to attain a measure of justice. Of course, my generation was not the first to recognize that our fate and future is not wholly determined by what occurs in North America. Frederick Douglass, the leading 19th century abolitionist who crusaded against slavery, spent a good deal of time in Canada and Europe and Ireland in particular in organizing solidarity on our behalf. Still, the bulk of my remarks this evening will be taken up with two leading 20th century figures who crusaded globally on our behalf. I'm speaking of W.E. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. However, the direct implications of my remarks are these. This is basically the takeaway, if there are any journalists in the audience. Where are today's black intellectuals and leaders who have grasped the link between the domestic and the global? Where are the black intellectuals and leaders who have factored into their analysis the rise of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, the so-called BRICS nations, and what their ascent means for us here in North America? What will their rise mean for the trajectory of white supremacy, which has bedeviled us for centuries?